This is awkward to film with this.
But now I'm just trying to figure out what wires go to what. Put your commentary in. Hi.
Welcome back everyone to this cold and rainy day on the build. I started out this week by installing our WeBoost antenna so that we can get cell service deep into the wilderness. So the first thing I have to do is find a place to mount this, which is the bracket that'll hold our exterior antenna. So I just drilled those holes, then installed these two riv nuts here, and that's what I'll be using to install that bracket onto the solar panel frame here. Just used a couple M5 bolts with some washers and some Loctite on them. It's super solid on here, so we'll move on. Now I'm going to be putting a hole in the roof to get the antenna cable to the antenna, and this should be the last hole that we have to put into the roof. Alright, so I've got this little grommet here that will protect the insulation of the cable, and I'm just going to use this stepper bit to find the right hole size so that the grommet fits. Then once the grommet's installed, I'll just run the cable through this hole and then through this housing here, and then I'll stick this housing to the roof, and this will just prevent any water from getting in through the hole that I'm about to put in the roof. So while I'm waiting for that paint to dry, I'm gonna just run the wiring for the WeBoost. So the antenna cable has got to go from over here across the van, and then the power cable has got to go from the same area over here down to where the passenger side DC fuse box will be. With the WeBoost installed, we moved on to our heater, even though the days we were installing it was reaching about 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So we got the Espar S2 D2L heater with the Sprinter kit. The S2 D2L is the new version of the pretty famous in the van world Espar D2 heater. Supposedly the S2 D2L is easier to install and has a quieter pump and quieter exhaust than the D2 heater. And just to note, the Sprinter kit that we got isn't really just for sprinters, it's really for any van, any RV really that you can get the Espar heater into. The Sprinter kit is just some nice extras that make the install a little bit easier on you. So that kit comes with the Easy Start Pro controller and a 3-meter long extension cord for the controller, as well as 3 meters more of exhaust tubing. And these two extensions that we got was really my draw towards getting the Sprinter kit, just because it allowed me to get the controller where I wanted it, and it allowed me to get the muffler and then the exhaust to exit where I wanted it to be. So we put our heater body under the passenger seat. So to start off this install, we had to remove the passenger seat.
Lefty-loosey, guys. Lefty-loosey, righty-tighty.
We're doing construction by the pear and the peach tree today. Okay, we got
We have no peaches, though.
no peaches.
The pears are coming in.
Yeah, we have tons of pears. Now that we have the seat off, before I can figure out the orientation for the heater, I need to figure out which direction the air flows through the heater. So
Side is the intake fan, and over here we have the coils that heat up. once the
intake,
temperature
sorry,
of the
got it.
fan is hot.
Thanks, Mr. and Mrs. Adventure. I just positioned it and then just kind of held this little gasket down, and then we'll trace those holes, and that's what we'll drill out. So now I've got this one hole drilled. I'm just going to go underneath and make sure we're not close to anything important. The 7/8 drill bit wasn't big enough to get the intake and exhaust ports of the heater through the floor, so now I have a bigger stepper bit and we're going to move forward with the installation. Alright, so here's the final layout. I did have to oversize basically every single hole just because they weren't all perfectly centered with the template. You can see, so we tried to lay out the template once, and this little hole here was the trial hole, and it was just, I was scared this one was getting too close to the support, so I moved it back a little bit. But yeah, it fits in there good now, and now I'll throw it in and then start working on the intake and exhaust hoses. Alright, so now I'm out of the van, clearly. And I'm gonna figure out how to run the exhaust and fuel line. I already did the intake, and that's a little bit easier. Alright, so the fuel line and exhaust are a little more complicated because I'm taking them from the passenger side where the heater actually is and running them all the way over to the driver's side. And that just adds a bit of complexity to things. So the reason I'm having both the fuel pump and the exhaust exit on the driver's side of the van is because those are the two things that really make noise on the exterior of the van for the heater. So that way, if we're parked in a city somewhere, you know, the passenger side of the van will be up against or closer to the sidewalk, but then everything that makes noise for the heater will be on the opposite side of the van, and hopefully just isolate that noise from anyone who might be walking by and do less to tip anyone off that there's someone in the van. Right, so onto the van now so I can show you how I ended up running the intake, fuel line, and exhaust. So it's kind of hard to tell because we got these in the way. But this is the intake. Oh, come on, focus. So this is the intake here. This is the exhaust line going up there. It goes through the floor. And then the fuel. Where is the fuel line? And here's the fuel line coming up here. It's kind of hard to see where it ends, but it ends up there. It goes through the floor, you can trust me. The intake is the easiest one. This comes down here, does a little loop, and then ends right here. So this is facing back and down to help keep debris out. They give you this little cover to help keep any rodents out, and then I also just found some window screen patch kit at Home Depot, and I threw that in there to prevent any bugs from getting into the intake there. So the exhaust, you see it coming down right there. It goes around this pillar, up and over the car exhaust. Keeps going, you can see it there. It goes up and over the drive shaft. This is the drive shaft. So the exhaust keeps coming over the drive shaft, around the fuel tank. This is the heat shielding for the fuel tank. Just comes around here. And then here's the muffler. I really like how that muffler is mounted because you can't see it at all from outside the van. So that's really nice. And then the last little tail goes there, and then it goes to the outside of the van. Okay, so then the fuel line keeps coming through here, goes by the exhaust, goes through here, and this is the downspout for the van fuel tank. So it keeps coming around here, goes to the pump. So this is actually the exit of the pump. I'm showing you guys the fuel line in reverse. So here's the pump, and then see this blue line comes back this way over that spout again, and then up, and this is where it connects to the van fuel tank. Alright, so here is where the exhaust comes out. It's right kind of at the back of the driver door here, out of the way, and it does get past the plane of the van to make sure that no CO2 gas kind of builds up and leaks through any cracks under the van. So good to go. We're looking at the wiring harness here for the heater, and it has 3 parts. The first one here is what we will connect to the controller. The second part of the harness just has 2 wires and is what will connect to the fuel pump. You'll have to push them into this plastic connector, which is what will connect ultimately into the pump itself. It doesn't matter what wire goes into which hole on the connector. So I've started both the wires into the connector, and you can see that green insulation or seal, I'm not exactly sure what it is, still sticking out of the connector, and you want to push them in so that there is no insulation outside of that plastic connector. And then you'll hear a slight click when that wire gets fully seated. So the third and final part of the harness is for the power. The plastic connector here can be ignored, as we will only be using the 3 wires. 2 red wires, 1 thick and 1 thin, are for the power, and we will need to put an inline fuse on each of them. The third brown wire will get connected to the ground. This is the fuse box that they send along with 2 loose red wires, again 1 thick and 1 thin, that each come with a crimped connector on one end. I was messing around a little bit trying to figure stuff out and pushed the thin wire into the fuse box, and I couldn't get it back out, so that's why we have it there. To connect the inline fuses, we'll have to crimp connectors onto the 2 red wires on the wiring harness. So I started by putting the little rubber insulation thing onto the wire, then stripped the insulation off the wire. My wire stripping tool actually didn't go small enough to strip the thin wire, so I had to use my knife, but I recommend using the tool if at all possible. So with that stripped, bring the insulator up to the edge of the wire insulation, and then you can push the connector over the exposed wire, and you can see here how the end of the connector kind of grabs the insulator to help hold it in place. Then the last thing we need to do is fold over the little wings on the connector down onto the wire to make the connection between the wire and the connector, and then also that's how the connector gets held in place. Then really clamp down on those little wings to make sure that there's a good connection that's securely held in place. And there are 2 sizes of those connectors for the thick and the thin wires. It's pretty easy to tell them apart as long as you know to look for the 2 different sizes. So with that done, we just need to rinse and repeat for the second wire, the thick wire in my case. And now with both of those connectors on, it's time to hook up the fuses. So push those connectors into the fuse box so that the thin wires are paired together and the thick wires are paired together. And then on the other side of the fuse box, you can push the fuses in. The thick wire gets a 20 amp fuse and the thin wire gets a 5 amp fuse. Then with those fuses in, we can go ahead and put the cover back onto the fuse box. Now the last thing we need to do to prep the wiring harness is to just strip off the end of the brown wire, and then again I twist those wires to make sure nothing gets frayed, and then we're ready to start installing the wiring harness. So for the controller, here's all the wires in the connector. It's going to push it through here, so I'm just going to follow that, push it through there and kind of over to the right, and then it comes out. Can you see it? It comes out over here, so you can see that now, and then we're just going to run this up, keep feeding it through, and it connects right here. So I connected that, got the pillar cover back on. Now I'm going to do the wiring for the pump. So I'm going to run it, there's a little gap here that goes under this black part, and I'm hoping I don't have to take this stuff up. I can just push it through And then on this side, kind of up under the driver's seat, in here, there's a little rubber boot that goes through the floor. So that's where I'll feed the wire through. Okay, so I just got the wire through. I did have to take up these black floor covers in order to push it through. You can see it there. So it goes, it's this wire going under here, goes under this, over here, then it goes down through that black boot to underneath the van. Right here, that's the wire coming down, and this boot had a zip tie on it, so I cut that off, got the wire through, and then put a new zip tie on. So there's that wire. The wire runs there, and then this is the fuel fill line for the main diesel tank of the van, and here's the wire running over it. So that wire continues on the other side of the downspout, and I used the fuel line of the pump itself, and I zip tied the wire to the fuel line in a couple places. So that comes around and ends at that plastic connector we pushed the wires into. Then just push that connector into the pump and we're all set. And Stumpy decided to join me for a little bit under the van today. So the last thing we have to do is solder the power wires from the wiring harness to the power wires coming from our power system in the van. So we'll start with the red wires. So you can take both of the red wires on the wiring harness and connect them to one wire coming from your power system. So I just twist all three of those wires together to kind of get them to hold while I solder them. And I ended up using a couple magnets just to help them get held in place until they are soldered. And they worked really well. I don't know how I would have done it without those magnets. So to solder them, you just want to get a little bead of solder onto your soldering iron, and I put it under my wires and just wait for the wires themselves to heat up, and you want to touch the solder to the wires, not the soldering iron. And once those wires are hot enough, they'll start to melt the solder, and that solder will move through the wires to the soldering iron. Solder actually moves to heat, so it can actually move against gravity towards heat. It's a pretty big ball of wires there, so it took quite a bit of solder just to make sure there was a good solid connection between all three of those wires. And then we just move on to the ground wires. So this is the brown wire from the wiring harness, and in my case it's a black wire that is the ground in my power system. So I twisted those wires together again using the magnets again, and same thing, get a little bead of solder. I put that under the wires and then just allowed the wires to get hot enough so that I could touch the solder to the wires and let that melt the solder and move through the wires to the soldering iron, creating a strong bond. And finally, I didn't show it here, but be sure to either use heat shrink around those connections or get electrical tape, which is what I did, and wrap those connections really well to protect the wires. Make sure they don't corrode at all from water, or they don't touch and short out on any metal in the van. Alright, so last thing to connect up is the main connector. It's the wiring harness side, heater side, and they just go together. And we're done. So now I'm just going to work on, well, you can't really see it, but there's a big mess of wires down there. I'm going to clean that up. And then we just have to put in the exhaust port for where the heat will actually come out. Okay, so we're in the last few steps of finally getting this heater installed. I just have to install this little port, which is where the hot air will actually come out of and go into the van, and then hook up this hose, which goes from the heater to the port, and we'll be done. The video file of me finishing this port install got corrupted. Unfortunately, we're having a lot of technical difficulties this week, so I can't show you exactly how I did it, but installing that port is pretty easy. I just used some Sika hold and put it around the lip of that little port and then pushed it into that hole I made in the seat base, and it stuck there really well. We've taken the van out a few times since I've installed it. Doesn't look like it's going anywhere, so I'm pretty happy with how that's holding up. Alright, so here we have everything, See, obviously the heater here, and then all the wires just kind of coiled over there. It doesn't seem like they'll move or shift around much, so I'm happy with that. Here we can see the tube, so this is where the hot air will come out, right here, and this thing can pivot around there. And then lastly there's the, what is this thing called again? There's the fuse box. I just took some Sikaflex and stuck it to that plastic panel. If a fuse blows, we can just kind of hinge that panel out and change a fuse without having to take off the swivel seat and get under here again. So now with the heater all buttoned up and installed and everything, we're gonna put back on the swivel seat.
Alright, so here's our swivel seat. We have a Scopima swivel seat. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. I'll throw a link in the description. So the first thing we did was just throw it on here and then swivel it. You can see the top is a little bit swiveled. So all of these holes are lined up and I can get to them to install the first screws. With the kit they send long bolts and short bolts. For this first one to go into the base and on the corners here, to go into the base like here and here, we use the long ones. So let's do that. Alright, so now to attach the seat to the swivel, we use the short bolts, and the bolts come in from underneath and then the nuts go on top. Alright, let's give it a swivel. Alright, there we go. That's where we're going to leave it this week, everyone. Thanks for watching. Thanks for sticking with us while we're releasing a little slower. We'll get back to weekly videos pretty soon. And we'll see you next week.